Welcome to the Gonzo Chronicles. I'm your host, Cyrus Alderwood, the official spokesman for Generation X. Stick around. It's going to get weird, as always. Well, happy belated 4th of July, and welcome back to the freaking Gonzo Chronicles. Today is actually July 6th. Um, Hopefully, everybody's doing well that's listening from down south that maybe have some tropical winds coming their way into Texas. So I know I have a handful of listeners down in Texas. So just be safe, everybody down there. As Beryl comes ravaging in there like the bitch that she is. Hey, so anyway, it's been a good fourth. Hopefully, everybody had a good fourth. And a safe one at that. Hopefully, you have all your digits. You haven't blown your fingers off or caught your ass on fire, anything like that. So I noticed on the fourth, this was leading up to the fourth, this really interesting post that was going around social media, especially over on X or Twitter. And it was called The Fate of the Signers. And this was really interesting. So I'm going to read this. And then I want to kind of debunk it a little bit because it's not exactly true. So I wanted to research this. So it says the fate of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. The following is often published and cited concerning the fate of the signers, but its accuracy is doubtful and should only be taken as traditional rather than historical. I'm going to read this and I'm going to talk a little bit about where this came from and then how much is true and how much isn't. It says here, have you ever wondered what happened to the 56 men who signed the Declaration of Independence? 5 signers were captured by the British as traitors and tortured before they died. 12 had their homes ransacked and burned. 2 lost their sons serving in the Revolutionary Army. Another had 2 sons captured. 9 of the 56 fought and died from wounds or hardships of the Revolutionary War. They signed and they pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. What kind of men were they? 24 were lawyers and jurists. 11 were merchants. 9 were farmers and large plantation owners, men of means, well educated. But they signed the Declaration of Independence knowing full well that the penalty would be death if they were captured. Carter Braxton of Virginia, a wealthy planter and trader, saw his ship swept from the seas by the British Navy. He sold his home and properties to pay his debts and died in rags. Thomas McKean was so hounded by the British that he was forced to move his family almost constantly. He served in Congress without pay, and his family was kept in hiding. His possessions were never taken from him, or his possessions were taken from him, and poverty was his reward. Vandals or soldiers looted the properties of Dillery, Hall, Clymer, Walton, Gwinnett, Hayward, Rutledge, and Middleton. At the Battle of Yorktown, Thomas Nelson Jr. noted that the British General Cornwallis had taken over the Nelson home for his headquarters. He quietly urged General George Washington to open fire. The house was destroyed and Nelson died bankrupt. Francis Lewis had his home and properties destroyed. The enemy jailed his wife, and she died within a few months. John Hart was driven from his wife's bedside as she was dying. Their 13 children fled for their lives. His fields and grist mill were laid to waste. For more than a year, he lived in forests and caves, returning home to find his wife dead and his children vanished. A few weeks later, he died from exhaustion and a broken heart. Norris and Livingston suffered similar fates. Such were the stories and sacrifices of the American Revolution. These were not wild eyed, rabble rousing ruffians. They were soft spoken men of means and education. They had security, but they valued liberty more. Standing tall, straight, and unwavering, they pledged, for the support of this declaration, with firm reliance on the protection of the divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. They gave you and me a free and independent America. The history books never told you a lot about what happened in the Revolutionary War. We didn't just fight the British, we were British subjects at that time, and we fought our own government. Some of us take these liberties so much for granted, but we shouldn't. So take a few minutes while enjoying your 4th of July holiday and silently thank those patriots. It's not much to ask for the price they paid. Remember, freedom is never free. I hope you will show your support by sending this to as many people as you can. It's time we get the word out that patriotism is not a sin, and the 4th of July has more to it than just beer, picnics, and baseball games. I must tell you, though, I do love the beer, the picnics, and the baseball games. So I want to back up here a little bit. Some of this wasn't true. As I was reading through this, the first here at the Battle of Yorktown, Thomas Nelson Jr. noted that British General Cornwallis had taken over the Nelson home for his headquarters. That's true. He quietly urged General George Washington to open fire. The home was destroyed, and Nelson died bankrupt. Not true. As a matter of fact, the house still stands today in perfect condition. They've done some renovations on it. There was some fighting probably around that, I would imagine, but the house still stands today. Almost, the original house. So that part's not true. The house was not destroyed. So there was some stuff here I looked up. I went to the constitutionfacts.com, went to the Library of Congress. I looked up some really interesting stuff about some of these folks. So, what was it that exactly that these men fought, and what happened to them? Did they even fight in the war themselves at all? Well, so I fact checked this as best I could. It's a decades old essay. Um, and it's been a public conversation. It's just sort of made its rounds again this year. I haven't seen it in quite a long time, but it's circulated again on Facebook, on Twitter. And of course it resonates when you read it. You're like, wow, these brave people gave up so much, right? But not all of that is true. So where did this actually start from? Um, the first uh, few days of July 2000, these columnists at newspapers, I think actually at the Boston Globe, I read, they were the ones who started running this again. But as you look back, something like this has been passed around for quite a long time, and it traced back to at least 1956 when Paul Harvey published a version of it in his book, The Rest of the Story. And of course, Slate and the Courant, they reported it, and then uh, anyway, similar versions of it was attributed to Rush Limbaugh, for example, some other online radio hosts throughout the 70s, 80s, and 90s. So this has been going around for a while. Um, but you got to wonder how much was true. Um, as I looked through this, I noticed actually where was it? I was looking at here something in the USA Today. Um, but anyway, one way or the other, this is a really relatable story, and if it does trace back to Paul Harvey, well, that's a pretty powerful source even back then. Um, but sometimes things get spun out of control. Sometimes you know things could not be exactly accurate, but they turn into legend. They turn into truth. So I question, anybody who's listened to this show for quite a while knows I question the history books. There's so many things in history that are vitally important that we were never taught in school. So, I looked up, well, on July 4th, I asked the Alexa. I said, what happened on this day in history? And of course, the response was, today's July 4th. We celebrate the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Well, that's not exactly true. On July 4th, 1776, the Continental Congress ratified the Declaration of Independence. All right, so that was an important day. I understand celebrating it. It was engrossed on parchment, and actually, it wasn't. After they ratified it, then it was engrossed on parchment. And then on August 2nd, 1776, delegates began signing it as they came in. So, no, when they say every year we're celebrating the signing of the Declaration of Independence, that didn't happen on July 4th. Something the history book should have clarified instead of teaching us that, hey, we signed it on July 4th, this is what we celebrate. No, we ratified it through our Continental Congress on July 4th. Signers didn't show up and start signing it until August 2nd. So why do we not recognize that day? I started to wonder that. Um, and why do we say July 4th instead of Independence Day? I don't know. uh, Kind of makes you wonder. Anyway, that aside, um, yeah, that was August 2nd, 1776. That's an important date. Also, I'm going to remember that this year. So, anyway, the Nelson House, right? That was the home of Thomas Nelson Jr., and he lived from 1738 to 1789. And he was Yorktown's most famous son and one of the signers, like I said, of the Declaration of Independence. Um, he was one of the more significant patriots to the cause during the American Revolutionary War, and he contributed significantly to the founding of this country. There's a lot people don't know. In our history books, and indeed in high school during our history, I wish we'd have not just taken the time to read the Declaration of Independence, but had like a week-long study of it. Same thing with our Constitution. But we should have went back and learned each of those men, even if we didn't have to memorize them. There's 56 of them, right? So um, we should have at least had to learn about them. So I looked this up on constitutionfacts.com, and there's a breakdown of each one of them. But anyway, back to the Nelson House real quick. Nelson's grandfather established that house in Yorktown, and he got there from England in 1705, and then he very quickly became rich and very influential. He was a merchant, so he built the home, the Nelson House, roughly around 1730, from what I've gathered. So his son William inherited the family business and went on to just accumulate all these extensive land holdings throughout the colonies. So he's one of the biggest landowners anywhere. William also became a powerful politician, and he served both the president of the governor's council and as acting governor at one point. So Thomas Nelson Jr. inherited the family business on the death of his father, William. So Nelson was given the title Junior to distinguish himself from his uncle, who was also named Thomas. It was kind of weird, but um, by the time of the Revolution, Thomas Nelson Jr. was incredibly powerful and influential in Virginia. And at various times during the war, he actually served in the Continental Congress. He also served in the state legislature and was governor of Virginia from June through October of 1781. So, as a brigadier general, he also commanded the Virginia military at the siege of Yorktown. So, his sacrifices for the war and his exposure in the just in combat contributed to his bad health. Apparently, he died during an asthma attack 6 years after the Revolution, and he's buried in the graveyard of Grace Church in Yorktown. I've never been there, but actually, I think I'd like to go there and just visit that place. Anyway, his wife Lucy continued to live in the house for more than 30 years after her husband's death, and the house remained in the family until 1908. During the Civil War, it served as a hospital for the Confederate and later for the Union forces. In 1914, Captain and Mrs. George P. Blow purchased the Nelson House and renovated it as the center of a large estate known as York Hall. So the National Park Service acquired the house in 1968 and restored it to its colonial appearance where you can go and visit it today. Um, anyway, you can find pictures of it online. It's a beautiful, beautiful house, and but at no point was it destroyed. So there we go. We fact checked that. So what were the fate of some of the signers? Um, we have to look back, and I'm not going to go through every one of these, but on there's actually constitution.org actually has this on here. Um, and there's some links on that page. If you just do a Google search, "Fate of the Signers of the Declaration of Independence," when constitution.org pops up, click on that. There's a bunch of links down below there that will sort of debunk some of this and confirm some of this. But I want to ask, have you read, when was the last time you read the Declaration of Independence? Um, I remember a history class in college that I had, and I had a professor, Dr. Garrett Sheldon. What an amazing professor! He was actually an expert on Thomas Jefferson, and he's been on television, PBS. He's been on C-SPAN at conventions in D.C., giving speeches and presentations and so forth. Anyway, wonderful guy. I loved having him as a history professor because a lot of these little nuanced facts he would bring up. He would plant it in our heads for us to go read it on our own if we were, history buffs. But even though I wasn't a history major. It just wasn't something that fascinated me until years later when I realized just how much of history we never learned that was important. So, according to constitutionfacts.com, and I'm going to read this is right from the top, all of the colonies were represented in Philadelphia to consider the delicate case for independence and to change the course of the war. In all, there were 56 representatives from the 13 colonies. 14 represented the New England colonies, 21 represented the middle colonies, and 21 represented the southern colonies. The largest number, 9, came from Pennsylvania. Most of the signers were American born, although 8 were foreign born. The ages of the signers ranged from age 26, and that was Edward Rutledge, to age 70, which was Ben Franklin. But the majority of the signers were in their 30s or 40s. More than half of the signers were lawyers, and the others were planters, merchants, and shippers. Together, they mutually pledged to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. They were mostly men of means who had much to lose if the war was lost. None of the signers died at the hands of the British. Let me read that again. None of the signers died at the hands of the British. And 1/3 served as militia officers during the war. 4 of the signers were taken captive during the war, and nearly all of them were poorer at the end of the war than at the beginning. No matter what each of these men did after July 1776, the actual signing of the Declaration of Independence, which began on August 2nd, ensured them instant immortality. The following gives a bit of information about each signer after the signing of the Declaration of Independence. So I'm just going to read the first one, but every one of them is listed here. And they go by state. So in Connecticut, the representatives that signed were Samuel Huntington, Roger Sherman, William Williams, and Oliver Wolcott. Actually, you know what? I am going to read all these. Delaware, because it's important. And if you're bored, I'm sorry, but this is important. These names should be etched in history. Now, in that email that circulated around, or that post that circulated around, it referred to Thomas McKean, and it spelled it wrong because his name is actually McKean with an N. He was from Delaware. So was George Reed and Caesar Rodney. From Georgia was Button Gwinnett, Lyman Hall, George Walton. From Maryland, Charles Carroll, Samuel Chase, William Paca, Thomas Stone. From Massachusetts was John Adams, Samuel Adams, good beer, Eldridge Gerry, John Hancock, and Robert Treat Payne. From New Hampshire, was Josiah Bartlett, Matthew Thornton, William Whipple. From New Jersey, Abraham Clark, John Hart, Francis Hopkinson, Richard Stockton, and John Witherspoon. From New York, William Floyd, Francis Lewis, Philip Livingston, and Lewis Morris. From North Carolina was Joseph Hughes, William Hooper, and John Penn. From Pennsylvania, George Clymer, Benjamin Franklin, Robert Morris, John Morton, George Ross, Benjamin Russ, James Smith, George Taylor, James Wilson. South Carolina was Thomas Hayward Jr., Thomas Lynch Jr., Arthur Middleton, and Edward Rutledge. From Rhode Island was William Ellery, Stephen Hopkins. From Virginia was Carter Braxton, Benjamin Harrison, Thomas Jefferson, Francis Lightfoot Lee, Richard Henry Lee, Thomas Nelson, and George Wythe. So, who was the most famous of all the signers? Well, by God, well, we said some big names there. But if you look at the Declaration of Independence, the guy who sticks out like a sore thumb is freaking John Hancock. So, John Hancock, born 1737, died 1793. John Hancock was the president after the signing. John Hancock was the president of the Second Continental Congress when the Declaration of Independence was adopted. He, along with Samuel Adams, were the two most wanted men in the colonies by King George III. He served as a major general during the Revolutionary War. He was elected governor of Massachusetts from 1780 to 1785 and from 1787 until his death in 1793. He was the seventh president of the United States and Congress assembled. Right, so that's from November 23rd, 1785 to June 6, 1786. And John Hancock was one of the original fathers of U.S. independence. So that's what happened to him after. Say, he was a very popular guy. Now, one thing you got to remember, when I read this little line, he was the seventh president of the United States and Congress assembled. There were, I think, 8 presidents overall. We always wondered, like, we're always taught George Washington was the first president of the United States. Well, under the Constitution, yes. But the Constitution didn't come till well after the Declaration of Independence, and then we had to fight a war. So who was in charge? Well, the Continental Congress would vote for a president. So elected officials would vote it that come from each colony. That's how and so we had like 8 presidents before George Washington. There were some very powerful men and very smart, capable men who were steered the ship before George Washington took the helm as the first president under the Constitution of the United States. That seems pretty freaking important too. We were never taught that in school. I didn't find out till I was in my, I don't know, late 30s. And the only reason I found out is I saw Prince talking about it on a talk show, that there were several presidents before George Washington. I'm like, what? So I had to go look it up. Who knew? Who knew? Anyway, a little history lesson today. Hopefully I didn't bore you. This is not gonzo stuff, but it's fun stuff. So here's my challenge to anybody listening today, or whenever you're listening to this. When you hear this, just go jump online. Or if you have a copy of it in your house, if you have a book with a copy of it, go read your Declaration of Independence. And read those 56 names to yourself. And just think, wow, if we didn't have a bunch of treasonous rabble-rousers that stood up to an empire and fought guerrilla warfare, by the way, we wouldn't be here. We wouldn't be America. We wouldn't be who we are today. So it's amazing. So thank God for treason. Anyway, it's another Gonzo Chronicles. I'll see you on down the road. Cheers, everyone.